Welcome to the Clause YouTube channel.
Together, we strive for a safer, secure, and more stable world.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Clause YouTube channel Strategic Frontlines. Today, we are privileged to have with us Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. He was our ambassador to Philippines, Tajikistan, and High Commissioner to Namibia. He is an author of many books, but his latest being Geopolitics in the Era of Globalization, Mapping an Alternative Global Future. We welcome you, Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, to this podcast. Please also welcome Vice Admiral Chawla, PVSM, AVSM, NM, VSM, PhD. He was the Flag Officer Commanding-in-Chief of the Southern Naval Command. He's also an author, and the title of the book is Maritime Power in China's Grand Strategy. Welcome, Admiral Chawla.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And please welcome Major General N.D. Prasad, AVSM, VSM, retired. He was the Deputy DG of Center of Contemporary China Studies and is the China expert. Welcome, N.D. General Prasad, to this show.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khanijo. Pleasure to be on part of the panel with such distinguished speakers.
No, it's a privilege to have such a panel today. And what we are going to discuss today is a very important event which has taken place. That is the US National Security Strategy, which was released recently. Now, if we see that this NSS strategy is very different from the one which was there previously. And I feel that this is because this national security strategy reflects and mirrors President Trump's ideas. And that is why it is a little different. It is not grounded in traditional political ideology, but it is centered around the core idea, what Trump believes is America first. And thus, it fuels the slogan of MAGA, that is Make America Great Again. And it gives a roadmap how this can be achieved through economic, military, and technological superiority. It tries to refute the past policies of American domination and expansive global goals and tries to focus on domestic and immediate neighborhood. Before we go forward, I would like to show you a slide which really highlights the crux of what you call the national security strategy. So please go ahead. So if we see this slide, we can see the core area. What it talks about is the Western Hemisphere, Europe, Middle East. It also talks about Indo-Pacific and the US technology, which they want to focus on. And it mentions three, that is AI, biotech, and quantum. Next slide, please. We also see that the drivers of American foreign and defense policies, which are based on various principles, what has been highlighted in the national security strategy. They are, of course, the national interest, then peace through strength. And this strength, they say, should come through economic, military, and scientific innovations. Non-interventionism, flexible realism, primacy of nations, sovereignty and respect, balance of power, pro-American worker, environment one needs to create, and the fairness to prevent free-riding trade imbalances, predatory economic practices. Next slide, please. And the last of this slide, it tries to say what are the important areas, what are the priorities for the US. They talk about migration, they talk about burden sharing and burden shifting, and that is quite visible in Europe, where the European nations have been told to increase their defense budget to 5%, as also to the allies in Asia. Western Hemisphere, European environment, making it how you can make it great again. The Middle East, Africa, where they want to ameliorate conflict and foster mutually beneficial trade. and finally Asia, where they want to lead from a position of strength. And this, they want to do it through economics and finally deterring military threats. So these are few of the highlights of what they want to do. And we are going to discuss some of the issues with our expert panelists. So my first question is to Ambassador Yogendra Kumar. Ambassador Kumar, a large part of discussion is centered around Western Hemisphere, what they call as Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And they also state that they want to prevent the non-hemispheric competitors. So there is a shift. So why there is a need for this? And they also try to talk about that they want to negate whatever past things that happened, especially the American domination and liberalism and the intrusive transnational organization. So all these things have been criticized. So is there a space now for other countries to come in, or it is simply a different approach, but the goal remains the same? So your comments, sir.
Right. Thank you very much. I think the language this time in 2025 NSS is different from that 2017. Of course, Trump is much stronger now than he was in Trump 1.0. It was the previous one written by General McMaster, and this one was written by the head of the Policy Planning Bureau of the State Department. And the focus actually is more in terms of economic strength, building the US economy stronger, and then in that process to leverage the US's comprehensive national power, the different components of it, to in a way to remain or to achieve number one position in the global economy and technology and military and everything else. And it is all anchored on the MAGA, Make America Great Again outlook, which is actually different from that of the previous administrations. The main point of that really is basically two things. One is the MAGA, the basic premise is the same, including on India. The MAGA approach for the US is for domestic policy as well as the mantra for rejuvenation of weak states. Then, of course, disengage from wars abroad except those of direct threat, excluding the Western Hemisphere, as you mentioned. For this kind of thing, you leverage your military technological capabilities as part of this national comprehensive national power. And of course, the main point is that the perception or the outlook on the global power equilibrium has not changed during this particular period. So the question here, as far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned, is very interesting because, as it is called, the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. And basically, the idea really is to maintain, in fact, it is very interesting the way it's been phrased there, because it is stable, well-governed intergovernmental cooperation against narco-terrorism and other kind of transnational criminal organizations, free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets, and supporting critical supply chains with continued access to key strategic locations. That's a position which they have articulated in this. And in a way, you can find that actually being done, so to say, as you can see, both in the case of Venezuela and also in the case of Mexico, which is, as you know, I mean, yesterday they actually raised the tariff to make them comparable, well, at least as far as India is concerned, comparable to what the US had imposed on India. Now, the point here is, it is still the basic premise, they're still talking about collaboration with both its allies as well as partners. And there is developing, as I mentioned, how we discourage others who already are collaborating. Let us say, I mean, basically the idea is really about China. So here it says that where the foreign influence is hard to reverse, accelerated efforts, including finance and technology, to induce these countries to reject such foreign assistance. The question really is that how that's going to be achieved. That's the big question. But you can see already the first step as far as the NSS is concerned, 2025, and the MAGA approach is concerned, that you can see in the Western Hemisphere. To what extent is successful? That's something we have to wait and watch and see, because whether it's Venezuela, about which you question the Congress, whether the approach that you are actually going to, let's say, establish your dominion or domination or hegemony or whatever you call, by the strategy that they're following now, Whether to what extent that will lead to those results that you're looking for, that is something one has to wait and watch. But you see the first kind of, let's say, implementation or realization of this particular policy you see in the Western Hemisphere. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to bring in Ambassador Chawla here. Ambassador Chawla, your initial remarks, as also I would like to ask you, Indo-Pacific was mentioned with focus on preserving freedom of navigation and reliable supply chains, as also Quad was mentioned. Further, focuses on building coastal and naval power of the US. So, according to you, is it a continuum of the policies which were there previous with greater impetus, or there is a diluted reference? And does India still figure prominently in the Indo-Pacific strategy? Your views, please.
Well, the one thing I'd say before answering your question is that all national security strategies cannot really restart or reinvent the wheel. They can only tinker with what's happening, because the period is too short. 4 years later, there will be another national security strategy. So the tinkering in terms of military strategy may sound radical, but in essence, it is a fine tuning of what's going on. So as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, there is a bit of semantic change against the principal, no longer the principal adversary, that is China. But at the same time, there is an emphasis on preserving the status quo over Taiwan, which is the principal flashpoint that is envisaged in the near future. And so there is a tacit acknowledgement, which is not new again. It is there in every report of China's maritime power, which is presented to the Congress, that China has a substantial naval power, and therefore there is a talk about ensuring or trying to preserve the overmatch, but at the same time they bring in the allies in the east, that is essentially Japan and South Korea, to say that unless they rearm and they re-equip, this overmatch will not sustain. So there is an implicit acknowledgement of the importance of the Indo-Pacific, which is not new, which is the old one, with a slightly lesser emphasis on its importance relative to the previous strategies. Uh, China is not being shown deliberately as a principal adversary, but it talks about economic sort of containment of China. It talks about asking the allies to build up, maintaining the overmatch, so that the Taiwan conflict can be prevented if possible. And as far as the Quad is concerned, I think while Quad is mentioned, it is a bit of a de-emphasis. And in that context, you can see that I think India is also mentioned only once. So while Quad remains, but the US policymakers have been increasingly questioning the relevance of India in Quad, for the simple reason that the other three members in Quad are treaty allies of the US. So Australia and Japan, and so therefore they are treaty bound rather, to come to the assistance of the US as specified in the respective treaties in any conflict, whereas India is not. And India has been at pains to de-emphasize the military aspect and saying that Quad is not a military alliance. And so the Americans are asking that if it is not a military alliance, then they're really, frankly, not too interested in all the other stuff that is going on. So I think there is a de-emphasis on Quad, which is there because of principally because of, I think, India's reluctance for obvious reasons. I mean, for reasons that India thinks are correct, and I think that is correct, of not calling it a military sort of a organization. So in sum, I would say the emphasis on the Indo-Pacific is still very much there. It cannot really go away, because economically this is the most vital region for the United States. And there is a bit of a de-emphasis on India because of the downgrading of the Quad. That's why there's a Squad, and there are other alternative mechanisms also being looked at, which would have a more military aspect.
Unmute, please. Unmute.
Uh, General Prasad, I would like to bring you in here because Admiral Chawla was mentioning about Taiwan. And I would like to ask you, in this national security strategy, Taiwan has been discussed explicitly, and especially the first island chain, as they stated that one third trade passes through it, and it cannot have hostile power to impose a toll system, or worse, to close and reopen it. So, which will of course become a global concern also. So they want to have a what you call it, they want to create a deterrence, that is the deterrent military threats. They want to deter the military threats, and for that they want to have what you call it, a favorable conventional military balance. And how they are going to do that, they mention it through collective defense. So they focus on the first island chain allies and partners, and they want them to invest in capabilities aimed at deterring aggression. So, what do you make of this? I mean, in future conflict, China will try to, if China tries to take over Taiwan, then will US and all their allies will come into it. And what is your take finally on this? And also your initial, uh, any initial comments on the national security strategy document?
Thank you so much, Dr. Khanijo. At the outset, I think this national security strategy of Trump 2.0 is, I think, flows from the first 2 pages of the document, which have been written by Trump himself, the forward. He more or less sets the tone of the document in the forward, and it flows from, if you look at the way Trump administration has been manifesting from day one, looking at homeland security and looking at economic engagement as the primary driver, that is commerce and trade and rebalancing the tariffs. More or less, the entire document is focused based on the forward written by Trump himself. So that's one thing I would like to say. And when we look at the chapterization and look at the amount of time devoted to Western Hemisphere and also to Indo-Pacific, while it appears that Indo-Pacific has been brought down from, let's say, Biden administration or Trump 1.0, I would say that the number of pages devoted to Indo-Pacific and the amount of deliberations done on Indo-Pacific is much greater. While the priority one remains Western Pacific, it will be incorrect to presume that Trump administration at this time will divorce itself from the Indo-Pacific at all. He's looking at economic engagement and rebalancing as one way of tackling China or not raising the hackles. That is the reason why he had the call with Xi Jinping, some time back, to set the the anxiety in China to rest, and also spoke to the Japanese Prime Minister. However, the fact that in the document they mention about engaging with India so that India is an effective partner of the Quad must not be lost sight of. During the India Today conclave in 2023, Michael Pillsbury was here. And when he was speaking at the conclave and also when he met us at the MEA, he clearly stated that the American elite or American State Department and the various parties, both Democrats and Republicans, have realized the mistake of engaging with China in the hope that China will open out and be part of the rule-based order, which has not happened. This realization has actually brought in a bipartisan kind of an alignment on how to deal with China. Notwithstanding their political differences, both Democrats and Republicans are very clear, and I think they come together on how to engage with China. That's one thing which we need to give it to the US State Department and both the political parties. Having said that, Indo-Pacific will continue to remain in focus. And therefore, the statements in the document that we need to look at a free and navigation, in Indo-Pacific, as also ensuring that they empower the countries in the first island chain to have a collective defense, is only to ensure that the stakeholders also have a reasonable amount of contribution to the defense of ensuring free passage in the Indo-Pacific. Earlier, the Trump administration is of the view that the earlier administrations have carried out defense of these areas, be it in Europe as part of NATO or Indo-Pacific as a unilateral endeavor. They feel that America must now get the stakeholders to contribute economically and also invest in their own defense expenditure so that the collective strategic aims are achieved. That's what I would like to say. As far as
Yeah.
Taiwan is concerned, the ambiguity that was kind of set to rest during Biden administration's last year, I think the ambiguity is being retained by the administration, saying that they would not like the status quo to be changed by any power. But by the recent allocation of funds to Taiwan to boost up its defenses, defensive, strengthening of Taiwan, and of course, joint patrol with Japan recently, post the Russia and China joint air active exercise, is indication that the US will not allow any kind of a change to be affected by China in the Taiwan Straits, or dominate the first island chain to prevent free navigation.
Yeah.
Very rightly
Thank
pointed
you.
out. Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, I would like to call you in because General Prasad spoke about economics. So a lot of analysis is also there as far as the economic security is concerned, especially reducing trade deficits, opposing barriers to our exports, energy domination, their strong financial sector, which needs to dominate, and the strengthening of dollar. So how do you think all these things are going to impact India?
Right. Okay. So the two issues here. First of all, Indo-Pacific, I just want to add something here. Actually, it is true that in the 2017 NSS, Russia and China were called revisionist powers. But if you see that here, that the US, the current NSS, is not really talking about any kind of a global, let's say, order in that sense. It's talking about power equilibrium, all right, but not about global order. So in that sense, the use of revisionist power actually becomes somewhat irrelevant. The point here is that actually, if you read the language of the NSS, actually it says that we reduce the dependence of US economy on the Chinese trade, for example. Then it also says that we actually understand the strategic significance of the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, the Western Pacific. It actually says that US will harden and strengthen military presence in the Western Pacific. The fact still remains that, of course, the discussion really is largely as to how we are going to, in a way, stabilize, or in some way to see as to how the global economy can be reordered in some way, which actually helps the US as it adversaries the NSS objectives. The point here is that as far as the Quad is concerned, I find a little strange that nowadays the discussion of the Malabar exercises actually is no longer in the discourse. The fact of the matter is the Malabar exercise actually is a mirror image of the Quad. And actually the exercises are far more sophisticated than US conducts with any other navy except perhaps the ally countries like NATO and that sort of thing. So the point here is that is not gone. And the role of India in that is certainly has been, even earlier had been said. For example, the language being used is that India should be encouraged. India should be encouraged to actually, in a way to work in such a way that the situation, remains stable and that sort of thing. And the power equilibrium actually does not change, which is in favor, let's say, is not in the favor of China in terms of China's own objectives. So that really is what I see here, because actually I mentioned very clearly all these kind of things, including, as I mentioned, the US will harden and strengthen military presence in the Western Pacific. So why is it doing that if that is not, the idea is not actually to maintain that kind of power equilibrium there? Now, as far as economic security is concerned, that is the larger dimension of the mega global economic outlook, where they have been talking about that all over, whether it is in the case of China and all the trade negotiations taking place, whether in the Far East or in Europe or with India or whichever country, or for that matter, even China, for example, or other countries, Mexico and Canada and so on and so forth. Now, there is, of course, the idea that you want the price open, but that is something which actually had been talked about by the American administration for a very long time. It is just that now, because of the fact that there is a greater interdependency, not just of India on the US and other countries, and vice versa, the Trump administration feels that they can drive a harder bargain. And that's what you see that, in fact, the discussion has just concluded, and President Trump spoke to Prime Minister Modi, and the idea actually to take it forward. So when we talk in terms of economic security and how they want to influence the, let's say, domestic economic management as far as India or other countries are concerned, the facts remains that there are the limitations beyond which they will not cross. Because as this NSS makes it very clear, the strategic value in the American perspective of India has not diminished. I think that is the important point to keep in mind. And of course, then you go into a little bit of the tactical aspect of diplomacy and all that is going on around us. But the fact of the matter is that if you see how, let us say, the negotiation being handled, the kind of statements being made from the Indian side, and now we hear from Trump at times, from the USTR and so on and so forth. The idea is to see how we can drive the best bargain in your national interest. But I will actually say that between 2017 and 2025, the orientation, the outlook certainly has changed clearly. One reason clearly is that the US economy is still having its own domestic problems. The second thing is that China has certain leverage on the US economy, which Trump wants to somehow see how he can manage that leverage. So I think it reflects that really. And in that sense, consistent with what the MAGA global outlook and the domestic outlook really is.
Admiral Chawla, as far as defense is concerned, they wanted to say that they want to revive their defense industrial base and they want to increase the capacity. Whether it is, they also spoke about the next generation missile defense, Golden Dome, and science and technology, they were saying, where they specified that the focus will be AI, biotech, and quantum computing. On the other hand, they also talked about burden sharing and burden shifting. So if in Europe, they have told the nations to increase their defense budget by 5%. They've also told their allies in Asia, whether it is Japan, South Korea, to increase their defense budget. So is there a dichotomy in this plan, or is it, or do you feel there is a plan behind it? And we see that the countries in Asia have already increased their defense budget. So how is going to impact globally? I think there is going to be a lot of spending as far as defense is concerned.
There are a lot of contradictions in the document between the actions that are being taken and the wishes that are expressed. And to some extent, I think it is natural, but these are excessive contradictions. The strategy tries to achieve everything, and in reality, there are different nuances that are really happening on ground. As far as defense spending is concerned, the US has passed almost a $1 trillion defense budget. But the problem is that they are unable to, for example, keep up the shipbuilding speed which the Chinese are having. In fact, the latest frigate program, only 2 ships have been built and the rest of the program has been cancelled. So I think it's inescapable that they have to rely on the allies to pump up the strength on their part to increase the force levels that they desire to have for the task that they want to have. And that is why they are encouraging the allies to, and that also reflects the state of the US economy. They are aware that they cannot on their own handle this. And it is now coming out as a realism that the others will have to step in. So I think inviting the allies to step in is not new. It's happened in Trump 1.0 also. And it's been a theme of the previous administrations also, not so forcefully. But the fact of the matter is that, for example, Europe has realized that it has to step up its act and it's increasing its budget. Similarly, South Korea has been given the go-ahead for getting SSNs from the US. Japan is also contemplating the same. So I think this is a natural movement because of the threat that the Chinese Navy poses now, the strength that it has vis-a-vis the US. And the US cannot alone combat that. So that's a realization and it's a public admission of that fact.
General Prasad, you had spoken about the economics of relationship between China and US in your previous comment, I would just like to ask you, there was a reference of China as being near peers.
I can't hear you, ma'am. I
Sorry.
think
General Prasad, I wanted to ask you, you had initially spoken about the US-China economic relations a little bit. So I want to dwell on that. I think for the first time, it has been mentioned that China is a near peer. So do you believe that China has caught up with the US? That is one of the thinking what US believes, or it is the other way around, because they also talk that there is a rebalance of America's economic relationship with China when they talk about mutually advantageous economic relationship with Beijing. That is precisely what they mentioned in the NSS. So how is this economic relationship going to be, whether it is going to be, I think it will be a mix of competition and cooperation, but how will it impact India? And also, as Admiral Chawla also mentioned, that there is going to be an increase in defense budget of most of the Asian countries. So how is it going to impact India? And we also need to increase our defense budget. Your views?
Thank you, ma'am. At the outset, I would like to say that the trade relation between China and US, as brought out by President Trump, has been adversarial to US interests. So therefore, he spoke about rebalancing the trade relationship between China and US. He does not talk about China as a peer competitor. It is not mentioned as a peer competitor in the current national security strategy. He mentions China as an economic competitor, and therefore he doesn't look at he looks at economy as a major driver of national security. I would like to put it this way. Hence, if you look at it, that big board he held of tariff imbalance with various countries, which he feels that economic engagements give an opportunity to prevent war because of mutual stakes being very high. And therefore, he's looking at trade rebalancing, economic rebalancing as one of the prime drivers to ensure that the advantage that China has had over the last, let's say, 2 decades since it has joined WTO is actually now set to rest, and the trade is being done on a mutually beneficial basis, and not any more advantage China. That's first thing. Second thing is, US has also realized that since the trade is so intertwined, it is very much, I would say, well nigh impossible for them to totally, decouple. So they're looking at alternate supply chains. If you look at India, US, ROK trilateral, or looking at other engagements that US is carrying out to ensure that the supply chain resilience is maintained while dependence on China is reduced to a large extent, while the trade balance is carried out, is the way he is looking at carrying it, taking the relationship with China forward. And also to assuage the Chinese apprehensions of potential conflict with the US in Western Pacific, and look at trade as an enabling factor in the bilateral relationship. They're promoting this. Articulation of national security strategy is also, while it is a document which the State Department and Pentagon and other officials will use as their uh, prime driver to formulate their own policies, it's also a message to the rest of the world that US is looking at not engaging in any kind of interventionism, which is what China was worried about, that the regime change and change of governance systems, bringing in democracy. He doesn't talk of all this now. So therefore, he's setting China's apprehensions to rest by saying that we're going to be non-interventionist. We're looking at trade, and we're looking at balancing trade. That's one thing. As far as India is concerned, as I brought out earlier, while what we are witnessing in terms of the tariff barriers and all that is what is visible to us on the face of it, the engagement that India and US have actually witnessed in the last, I would say, decade or so, or more than a decade, in fact, since the signing of the nuclear agreement, has actually been beneficial to both. We have a lot of convergences which cannot be wished away. So therefore, India's engagement with US is quite strategic and is only going forward in ensuring that we both look at our common threats. The visit of Prime Minister Modi to US in February and signing of a number of deals, one of them, of course, taking forward ISET to the next level, and a couple of more deals have been signed, is a fact that while what is what is being witnessed in the media in terms of trade agreements and trade differences, I think strategic convergence exists. And if you see recently, there has been a bipartisan blowback on China, the way Trump is dealing with India, even on trade barriers. So I see that there is no way forward for US and India but to come together on these convergences against supply chain resilience, looking at the common threats and addressing them. So therefore, that is something which is going to be there. While what is brought out or what is whipped up in the media is totally different to the engagement that is actually happening. It might have slowed down, but I'm sure the both the Republicans and Democrats are going to push President Trump to engage with India more proactively and more constructively. As far as defense spending is concerned, even Trump administration has forced Europe or NATO countries to spend more on defense. From they have increased the defense spending from 2% to 5%. That's a big change, and he's made it very clear to these countries in NATO and European Union that they are as much a stakeholder in in their national security, and therefore it's time for them to actually contribute to the security of Europe. India's defense expenditure in the last, I would say, couple of years has been very low compared to as a percentage of GDP. When you compare it with percentage of GDP, it is as low or lower than what India spent during the 1962 as percent of GDP. I'm not talking about the absolute numbers. While a large number of modernization programs are underway, there is a need for the government to look at uh, leveraging the economic growth that country is witnessing to enhance our defense preparedness. Deterrence is extremely important to ensure that we are able to leverage our economic growth story to our advantage. If we don't invest in deterrence, we will actually be facing numerous threats, not only in our neighborhood, but also in the strategically important areas. So I think there is a need for us to look at our defense budget in a more holistic manner, look at long-term plans, and look at capacity building as an important part of India's growth story. India's growth story, or Viksit Bharat, cannot be divorced from uh, building up India's capacity in the military sector or military modernization. Thank you.
Admiral Chawla, would you like to add something to the military aspect of it, what General Prasad just mentioned?
Yeah, I totally agree that our military buildup or the strengthening of the armed forces needs much more momentum. If you see what's happening in the other parts of the world, Europe was mentioned. They have already targeting 3.5% by 2035. Even though President Trump wants it to be increased to 5%, but that's I think only Poland is the only country that has so far achieved it, and the others will probably achieve it much later if they can at all, because 5% of GDP is a big ask in light of the economic realities that these countries are facing. So we need to really step up. I think the recent conflict also has shown that deterrence, as General Prasad also mentioned, is something that needs to be strengthened, because what is rightly brought out in this strategy, the national security strategy, which is there in almost every strategy, that war prevention is always better than war fighting. And to prevent war, you need to be strong and demonstrate that strength so that the others are not provoked into, are not, see an excuse to start a war with you, or see a chance of winning that war. So there's no doubt that we have to strengthen our military. How we do it, I think that's for the national strategy to decide. There is already a strategy in place, even though it's not public, but the fact of the matter is that all three dimensions will have to be strengthened, because we are the only country facing two nuclear armed adversaries, and both of them, China and Pakistan, are colluding with each other in many facets of security, as well as was seen during the recent Op Sindoor operations. So I think there's no choice for India but to strengthen its military, its defense preparedness, and for that I think it's important that we also leverage civil military infrastructure. We sort of combine the resources, and more importantly, we move towards jointness in a more deliberate manner. I think we will need to get into integrated commands, which has been planned for a long time, to leverage, to synergize the resources of each service, which will make them more than the individual parts. So I think there is the defense ministry had said this was the year of reforms, and I'm sure these reforms will happen sooner or later. But all these measures are overdue and need to be taken as early as possible.
Uh,
Yeah.
before we take before we take questions, we have with us Yuvvraj. He's looking into US. He's a research fellow at our at CLAWS. So, Yuvvraj, I would like to ask you if you would like to comment something, or you would like to ask some questions to the experts. Please come in.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, and good evening to all. So I think, ma'am, most of the principles behind the document have been covered by the esteemed panelists here today. I think there are just two small points that I would like to make or ask of the panel. The first one that I feel has not been talked of enough during the discussions regarding regarding the document has been that the document mentions that the NATO is not an expanding alliance anymore. So that's a very big statement coming from the national security strategy of the US, because as you know, it's one of the main pretexts that is used by Russia to attack Ukraine. So my question is to Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, sir. Sir, does this posture of the US increase or open the space for Russia for strategic maneuvering, not just in Asia but around the world? Because it's one of the, as I've said, it's one of the pretexts of Russia attacking Ukraine. So if the US itself is signaling that NATO will not be expanding eastwards, so does it open space for Russia? So.
Thank you. First, very quickly on the defense side, I think there's no question that we have to keep strengthening our defense capability and across the entire spectrum of our national security threats, go without saying. The other point, of course, is that the nature of warfare is changing, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine, as we've seen in the case of the Gaza conflict, and elsewhere. Because of the fact that it's changing so rapidly, so we have to keep pace. And we found that even when the Ukraine conflict is going on, even the Americans and NATO countries were not quite prepared at the way at which things were changing in that theater. The other thing, of course, is that we are also country with a lot of capabilities. So it gives us opportunities for export, for example, of military hardware. It actually helps us in expanding and building our network of relationships, both in terms of developing capabilities, enhancing our outreach, enhancing our export targets, and so on and so forth. So that's one point. As far as NATO is concerned, I think Trump's position actually been quite consistent from the very beginning. And that's why I said that the Ukraine conflict is completely avoidable. And the point basically is, in fact, if you read the NSS 2025, something very interesting. It says that there is a need for significant US diplomatic engagement to re-establish strategic stability across Eurasia and mitigate conflict. Conflict risk between Russia and European countries. Secession hostilities in Ukraine is a core interest, and its survival as a viable state. And it talks about the European dysfunctionality vis-a-vis Ukraine conflict because of various domestic reasons that is mentioned there. The fact of the matter is that the way the conflict has been prolonged, it has been very largely a very shambolic approach of NATO itself to the way this conflict actually developed. So if he's saying that that's what he's saying, that now is the time for the US to engage directly with Russia so that you can re-establish the Eurasian stability, equilibrium. And equilibrium at the moment that is not against either European or the American interests. The point is that if we can re-establish the equilibrium, that is fine. But the NATO approach, basically European countries talking about, their approach has been in that sense negative, and actually even now has been saying that. in so many words, if you see statements which are coming out in the press, that the way to do it is to engage directly with Russia, and there you find an approach by which you can protect the strategic interest of the Europeans and also the Russians, and thereby stabilize the situation, because the way the war has gone on, it actually has become so protracted and it's so devastating for the Europeans themselves that its effect on them will be lasting for a very long time. And you can see between, and in fact, it's mentioned in great detail that, they've been talking about, NATO, Russia and all the rest of it, they're buying from them oil, they're buying from LNG, and so on and so forth. So the point basically is that what it's saying is that the way the Europeans have handled NATO, let's say handled NATO in the sense NATO's approach to the conflict, actually counterproductive. So I think that is an approach where I think a lot of us will agree with that, friend, as one has been monitoring the way the conflict actually unfolded, friend. Yeah.
Yes. Ma'am, if you allow, I have a second question to Vice Admiral Chawla, if you just allow me.
Okay, just go ahead.
Yeah. So, ma'am, I think it's the first strategy in a long time that does not mention Islamic terrorism or Islamic fundamentalism as a key threat to the US. So my question is to Vice Admiral Chawla that the document is largely positive towards the Middle East. It's basically following a laissez-faire approach of a hands-off approach, where it's saying that we will let them be. We will not topple. We will not, essentially saying that there will be no regime changes going on from the American side. We will let the monarchies of the Middle East be as they are. So basically giving a free hand to the monarchies, especially Saudi Arabia, and to their allies in Syria. So, sir, my question here is to you: how do you see Mohammed bin Salman or other allies of the US in the region going forward? Basically, how are they taking this in their own stride, sir?
Yeah, it does signal, but the issue really is that the Middle East requires American presence. If you go to the Middle East and speak with them, because there is the schism between the Shias and the Sunnis, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and therefore the only balancer currently that they look at is the United States, and that's why I said this document is contradictory in many ways, because the preponderance of U.S. military bases in the Middle East is not reducing. The presence of the U.S. in Iraq is somewhat reduced, but it is not entirely gone away. The U.S. is very closely involved with Israel in any case, including in the recent Israel-Palestine war. There has been the only armed action that the U.S. has taken is on Iran. So in the aerial strike that took place on its nuclear stockpiles, which were suspected of having enriched material. So I think these are, I would say, not really reflected in the actions on ground. The CENTCOM remains one of the most combat-ready combatant commands which has engaged in conflict. The conflict against the Houthis saw the United States again playing a leading role in the Red Sea. So I don't think the statements are reflected. Yes, what they are talking about is that they will not support future Arab Springs or something out there. But I think that era has passed. The Arab Spring era has passed, and the monarchies are firmly entrenched in the system of the Middle East. So what they are stating is very much the obvious. I mean, there's never been any challenge to the Saudi monarchy, nor do I think there ever will be, because the society is built around the monarchy. And as far as the other countries are concerned, you'll recollect that the US has obtained great investments from Oman and from the UAE. President Trump was there in one of his first visits after taking over. So I think the engagement with the Middle East is very much there for reasons which both sides want and will continue to be there. Yes, the difference really is, which is again not new, that the requirement of oil from there, which was a preponderant requirement in the last century, has gone away, because the US today is the largest producer of oil and natural gas. Oil rather, not natural gas. And so it doesn't really require shipments from the Middle East. So that is something that has gone away. But I think the US will remain and is committed to that place in all senses, physically, in terms of combat power, And that's again one more reason why, in fact, they have cozied up to Pakistan is Iran. So therefore, this statement is to be seen more in the terms of less political interference, but they will be engaged with boots on ground there, I think, for a very long time to come.
May I add something here?
Uh,
May I add to
yes,
it?
please. Yes,
Okay,
please
so
go ahead.
on the Gulf, the NSS actually is quite interestingly worded. It does talk about that the Cold War period is over, and there is certainly some kind of a great power rivalry there. And the basic objective of the US really is to make sure that it doesn't come under domination of any other rival power. That's the basic point that it's making. The other point is making, and again, very interesting. It says because it considers, this is the old traditional US view, that the Iran being the major source of terrorism in the region, Iran has been very largely degraded. And because of that, then it talks about how the Hamas has been degraded, how the others, and so on and so forth. And because of that, he feels that a measure of stability can be restored in that area where, let's say, there can be more prosperity and so on and so forth. What is interesting here is this, and maybe that might show a certain change in attitude or certain, let's say, we have to observe that very closely. And that is in the 2017 NSS. It mentions that as regards Pakistan, the US continues to face threats from transnational terrorism and militants operating from within Pakistan. So that actually is not mentioned here. One, of course, is that Trump has already complimented them for collaborating in
Yes.
terms of ISISK. But the fact of the matter is the ISISK has not disappeared at the first point. It seems they're collaborating. That's what Trump actually said. But the fact of the matter is that there's not been eliminated. And Al-Qaeda is very much present in that area. So as far as terrorism is concerned, emanating from Pakistan, that actually has, in a way, lost its focus somewhat. Though the NSS does talk about the surging Islamic terrorism in Africa, and which is what they have to continue. So that is one key lesson that I will draw from the current NSS. Thank you.
There's
I just
one
come in for a
question
minute,
which,
ma'am,
yeah,
if you allow.
and you can answer this question also, and your comment. There is a question which says, if you had to rank the top 3 focus area of the strategy, what would you say are US top priorities? General
Yeah, firstly,
Prasad.
let me just answer this question first and then give my comments on the previous one. I think the way Trump administration started manifesting from day one, he's looking at homeland security, that is mass migration. That is one of the, among the key threats that they have actually identified, it is mass migration. And therefore, if you look at it, the shift in focus or increased focus on Western Hemisphere and the Trump corollary to Monroe Doctrine. While they're talking of non-interventionism, when it comes to Western Hemisphere, it is to be, we have to understand that he talks about Trump corollary to Monroe Doctrine. Therefore, when it comes to America's neighborhood, they are looking at shaping the neighborhood so that it is aligned to America's national interests. That's one thing. Second thing, he's talking about unfair trade practices. He's looking at the tariff barriers and the way he's been putting barriers on the countries to balance out the trade. He's looking at unfair trade practices, which he feels that the globalization was a mistake and it has not delivered in terms of getting China onto the rule-based global order, and therefore he feels that these, I would say, advantages given to some of the countries when engaging in trade should be now done away with, and the trade should be on a mutually beneficial terms. And of course, one thing which he again talks about as a key threat is erosion of traditional values. He talks about influence of transnational organizations and other countries influencing American way of life, American culture, US culture. So he's talking about, these are the three key threats that he's talking about. An observation on the previous question raised was, firstly, if you look at the forward, he talks about in the last 8 months, Trump administration has actually settled 8 regional conflicts, of which he talks about Israel and Iran, and he talks about Egypt and Ethiopia, and of course, war in Gaza. And he says that during Operation Midnight Hammer, they've been able to more or less obliterate Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity. Having said that, in the document, he also, when they identify their core foreign policy interests, one of the interests, he says, is prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, its oil and gas supplies, and the choke points through which they pass, while avoiding the forever wars that bogged us down in the region at great cost. So while he's saying that we're going to be non-interventionist, he's quite certain the way things have shaped up, be it Gaza, be it Israel, Iran, be it everything else, he's quite confident that there'll be no more need for any military intervention. But that does not mean that the military presence will be brought down as noted by Admiral Chawla. They will continue to have military presence because oil and gas and their transit through various choke points through the sea lines remains extremely important and vital for global trade to continue and stability in the global trade. That's all.
Yeah, you rightly pointed out, because he calls himself as president of peace, a deal maker. And in the document also has mentioned about the 8 conflicts which he had been able to negotiate. The other question is, it's asked by Akashika. She wants to know, would the US support Ukraine returning to diplomacy, even if it requires territorial compromises? Or is there a red line for what a settlement should look like? Admiral Chawla or Ambassador, anybody can take it.
The peace negotiations. Sorry, the peace negotiations that have been going.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, the peace negotiations that have been going on are still dragging on because there is this fundamental disagreement between the United States and Europe and Ukraine on one side and United States on the other, wherein the US has been President Trump has been very clear from the beginning that he would like to see an exchange of territory and that he feels that Ukraine will not be able to prevail against Russia. And so therefore, to prevent further loss of life, they should compromise on the territories, and the Donbas region in particular should be given to Russia. The Europeans are, to my mind, correctly not with this plan because it violates a long-standing international convention of the sanctity of international borders as laid down the United Nations after the Second World War. And therefore, they feel that if you agree to this, then it will be laissez-faire for smaller countries to be taken over by larger countries by force. So I think unless this contradiction is resolved in some manner, and Ukraine also is not, as the president has stated, that the constitution does not allow him or empower him or his government to cede territories. So what they've been proposing is a sort of an armistice, which is opposed by, that means stopping having a ceasefire without conceding territory in perpetuity, and holding on to the line as has been done between South Korea and North Korea now for the last almost 75 years since the ceasefire. So I think unless this dichotomy is resolved or Russia manages to take the entire Donbas region by force, it will be difficult for people to come to a sort of a compromise on this.
Ambassador Yogendra Kumar, you wanted to say something? Please go ahead.
No, I think this is certainly this is really the sticking point in the negotiations, no doubt about that. And the Ukrainians also are saying that our constitutional position is that. So how do we navigate, let's say, to this particular position given our constitutional constraints? It requires a referendum. That's what they said. It requires an election. So it's a kind of catch-22 situation building up. But my sense is that as the things are, they'll actually have to be. I mean, there's a realism in that sense on the part of the Americans. Sadly, the past history actually has not set a good example of that. The fact of the matter is that this is the situation on the ground, and they have to find some formulation by which they can actually, in some way, try to see that this situation on the ground and this is how we are going to manage it through some kind of an agreement. Now, as far as the territorial sovereignty and so on and so forth is concerned, the history, post-Cold War history or the Cold War history is full of, flagrant violation of these norms. We have the example of Iraq. I can quote chapter and verse. The point is that now that's happening in that area is happening also because of the fact that the Europeans and of course Americans at one point, were actually stirring the pot in Ukraine because of the fact that it is just basically the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because of which these countries emerged as unstable countries. And against the advice of George Kennan, against the advice of Henry Kissinger, they wanted to keep on stirring the pot there. And now they find themselves, they're created a situation where they don't know how to quite handle it. And that's why they are sort of flailing their hands about in that particular manner. So there's a lot of introspection required in this. And they have to think as to how they must conduct the international relations at a later stage. And one last point I'll make very quickly. The entire NSS that we talk about is actually completely silent as to how the challenge that we face at the global level, how they're going to be addressed, whether they are nuclear non-proliferation, WMD, whether it's bioterrorism, bioweaponization, weaponization of artificial intelligence, and climate change, of course, is being dismissed out of hand by President Trump. But the fact of the matter is there's so many of these challenges which you cannot resolve any other way unless you create some kind of regulatory framework. In the Cold War, some framework actually had existed. Some framework had developed at the end of the Second World War. Now all that has ended. So you find a situation here that the volatility is going to increase in the future. And that is one major upshot as far as the current thinking of the administration is concerned. And that is something that we have to see how best to actually protect our interests. Thank you.
Very rightly pointed out, because a lot of challenges have been missing in that. For example, Yuvvraj also mentioned about terrorism, so that there was no mention of it. And related to that is one question. It says, how do you interpret US suddenly cozying up with Pakistan, and where do you think it fits in the US new national security strategy?
To whom?
Anyone can answer. I mean,
okay, let me give it the first shot. I think in the case of Pakistan, very clearly there are multiple factors. I think one can go on and on about that. One clear factor is that because of the fact that that's my take, I could be completely wrong. I'm sure the field marshal knows better. But the fact of the matter is that the Pakistanis are presenting themselves as some kind of a role player in the Middle East, particularly as far as the Gaza settlement is concerned. They've been talking about, as observers, they've been talking about sending, the peacekeeping force there to disarm the Hamas and so on and so forth. And that position actually has led to internal conflict in Pakistan itself, because it depends as to how the peace building builds up in the Gaza area, because otherwise the Pakistani population actually is very anti-US. That's the first point. The second thing is that, of course, maybe there's expectation that they'll be getting some kind of an economic benefit. And the fact of the matter is that I think the US has some interest to see that Pakistan doesn't collapse, because just you have seen that, like Biden, the Trump administration just now offered the sale of upgradation of the F-16s. Which has been a long-standing conversation that Pakistan had with the Americans, whoever has been in power there. So in one way, you see that kind of an approach. But I am not quite sure that Pakistan can still be called as an ally of the Americans. Or in today's context, I would say that Pakistan can be seen as it was in the Cold War period or post-Indian independence, could be seen as some kind of balancer as far as South Asia balance of power is concerned. Those days are gone. It is that they're trying to find out some way in which they think they can make, it's a big country, so maybe they can make some use of it. Thank you.
Any last comments from General Prasad and Admiral Chawla?
I think this was a very interesting question, because this is something which many people have in their mind as to why is US engaging with Pakistan while India remains its strategic partner, keeping the larger strategic threats that are emerging in the globe globally in mind. And I think the ambassador has brought out very clearly and very lucidly as to what is the reason for which US is engaging. Pakistan somehow creates conditions in which it becomes a necessity for US to engage in this region, be it Middle East or South Asia. I think the Americans are following Arthashastra more than we are following the mandala theory. I think they are learning from Chanakya, while we have relegated Chanakya to certain amount of tutorials and just an expose. But I think they are applying Mandala theory on South Asia and larger Asian subcontinent more than I think anybody else is doing. I mean, just on a lighter side.
Admiral Chawla?
Yeah, coming back to the US national security strategy, I think I would just like to say that, while the language and many things are a departure from the past, and maybe not a very welcome departure, if I can put it in that manner, it does reflect the current mood in the United States. And, it is good that countries like the US put out their national security strategy, because you get a very clear understanding of what their position is on most issues. And while we may criticize or we may discuss parts of the strategy, it does play a large part in informing, in deterring, in sort of making the adversary go down certain rabbit holes based on what is written in the security strategy. So I think in some it's a very good exercise, and I think it should be emulated by other democracies, particularly India, so that we articulate India as a very important country, one of the emerging powers of the world, and I think it's time that India also articulated its national security strategy, so that people understand what we are up to, and it does play the role of a deterrent as well.
Yes, I think it very clearly mentions the action plan of Trump's. I mean, whether it is economics or other areas, what he wants. So now I would like to thank all our panelists for such a detailed analysis of the national security strategy of the US. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.